Well, thanks again for joining me on my daily dose. Today, for me, health-wise, has been a wonderful day. I've been telling a few people that have been asking that it may be the best day I've had in about 6 years. And I mean that because today I've had very little of any side effects from the medication. I've been able to get out and walk. As a matter of fact, as of right now, I've walked 40 laps, which is 2 miles. And I was doing 2 miles right before transplant, but I'm doing 2 miles now, and it's an extreme accomplishment to be able to do that. I had kind of a funny story come out of that today, though. My doctor, Dr. Talaj, came in and was picking at me because I'm supposed to do at least 20 a day. If you do that, you can be ready to go home anytime, pretty much. But he came in this morning and saw I had only done 12. Well, when he began to pick at me about that, I reminded him, well, I did 17 the day before. So then he turned that back on me and he said, well, it sounds like you owe me 3 from day before yesterday and you owe me 8 from today. And of course, I've got to get 20 in addition to that. And so I just bound and determined as I wanted to be, went out and walked 40 laps, as I mentioned. And so I put my lap sheet back out on my door. I gave myself credit for the 3 I was missing from the first day, the 8 I was missing from the second day, all 20 of today's, and then I put 9 more on there, which I had done, and put a little tongue sticking out at him so that he would know that when he came up. And so I can't wait for him to show up tomorrow and let him see that I am doing well and that I'm determined. And that's all that I ever plan to be, is just determined. And I'm determined to do what I can do to help myself and those around me. So my health has been great today, and I thank all of you who are asking. I especially thank all of you who've been viewing this program. It's been much more than I ever expected it to be. It was really something intended as much for the family as anybody, but I have had an outpouring of love because of this, and of course, my whole situation. I could never thank you enough for that. But I want to turn our attention tonight to something more spiritual, as we always do. You remember a day or so ago, I submitted to you that you might offer me some suggestions, your favorite verses, your most encouraging verse. Tweet those things to me, and I would use them as soon as I could. Well, one of the technical winners from yesterday that I mentioned was Brother Matt Walling. Now, he sent me a verse that he thought was very encouraging, and I agree totally with him. It's found in Acts chapter 2 and verse 44. Now, let's notice that verse, but I want to put it back in its context after that, discuss it for just a moment. Acts 2 and verse 44 is a very simple verse, and it says just this: and all that believed were together and had all things common. Now, the point I want to make with this tonight is to talk about togetherness, because you and I need a level of togetherness. We need the support of God, and of course, if we're Christians, we're going to have that. If we're faithful, we're going to be able to access God through prayer and many other avenues where He's going to bless us. But while we're on this earth, we are dependent on one another. And when we're reading this from Acts 2:44, we're talking about the time of the early church. As a matter of fact, on the day of Pentecost, the earliest days of the church that we could ever consider. And we learned there that in that day, at that point in time, the church, speaking of those people, they had all things in common. They were together. There was togetherness, and that meant so much. As a matter of fact, now I want to back up and put it within its context, and I apologize that we can't go for the true context, which would go much further up in the chapter. But if you'll back up with me to verse 41, let's read from verse 41 to verse 47 together and notice the verses we come through. Verse 41 begins and says this: and they that gladly received His word were baptized. And the same day there were added unto them about 3,000 souls. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, and fellowship, and in breaking of bread, and in prayers. And fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done by the apostles. Now verse 44 adds, and all that believed were together and had all things common. Verse 45, and sold their possessions and goods, and parted them to all men, and every man as he had need. And they, continuing daily in one accord, notice that phrase, in the temple, breaking of bread from house to house, did eat their meat with gladness and singleness of heart, praising God. Verse 47, this is wonderful too. Praising God and having favor with all the people. The Lord added to the church daily such as should be saved. Friends, there is so much that we could discuss from this passage. Back all the way up into verse 41, we notice that these were the people who were baptized. These were the people who were added to the church. And that may be another thought for another night. There's only one church. There's the church that Jesus built. But it was those people. It's those people who you find in verse 44 who now had all things in common and were together. It's those people who were of one accord. It's those people who shared things one with another. And it's those people, verse 45 told us, having land, sold it and laid it at the apostles' feet. Friends, could you imagine living in a day when people honestly, Christians, and that's who this was, honestly followed God's word to such an extent to be this caring, this sharing, and to have this level of togetherness. You know, that's what the church ought to be. Sometimes people are looking for utopias. We see people sometimes and we consider themselves to be a little off the wall, a little strange. And what they do is they go out and they form a community. And I'm not endorsing any of this, but they'll go out and they'll form a community, buy 100 acres somewhere, and all the people will move in together. And they'll kind of confine themselves to that. And most likely and typically they follow some strange religion in doing that. But they're claiming to build a utopia where they have all things common, where they share things together. Now, friends, that's not what we ought to do necessarily. We ought not be in that way to pull ourselves from the world. We need to be in the world in order that we might try to save it. But the idea of having all things common, the idea of having togetherness, as mentioned there in verse 44, is one of the most wonderful thoughts you could ever imagine. When we consider this, we have to consider that this is what the early church did. This is God's inspired example of what they were already doing that early in those days. So I want you to consider with me something. We as Christians, members of the church, do we have all things common? You know, I've been so blessed while I've been sick, and even before that. I mean, I've always found an outpouring of love in the church, and I hope that you find that. It should be there. But I've always found that people share. People have togetherness. They want to give you what they have. Now, in my case, many times lately it's been finances. But whatever area it is, when we share those things together. Now, one interesting thing I want to show you, if you go back and look at verse 44 again, let's read it more carefully. And let's just change some of the language there to make it more accurate with the Greek. Verse 44 says this, and all that believed, the next two words, were together and had all things common. Those two words that say were together does not imply that every Christian on the face of the earth came to one place and met. That's not what that implies. The term here literally means agreed together. So why are they sharing things? Why are they coming together? Why do they have things in common? Because they agree. And what they agree upon is simply this. They agree that God is right. So once one is baptized, added to the church, saved by the very power of God, once he's done that, why not perform the togetherness that is needed? Why not spend your days as Christians sharing and having things in common? And maybe one day there'll be a time when you as an individual or as a group of people, when you may want to sell something, get rid of something you don't need just to help someone else. It's a wonderful opportunity, and I really appreciate this verse. Matt, you're exactly right. It's one of the most encouraging, inspiring verses of the Bible. I want to point your attention as we close to another passage, and I won't direct quote it, but I'll give you the suggestion of it. In John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35, Jesus speaks about the subject of love. And what he says about that, he adds there in verse 35, and by this, speaking of love, will all men know that ye are my disciples. Friends, when we show the act of love through togetherness, the world will know. The latter verse here that we read across said, and they found favor with all the people. Friends, I know we'll be despised. Jesus himself said sometimes Christians will be hated just for his name's sake. But at the end of the day, when we act out the things that we ought to do properly with the best attitude and the best relationship we can one toward another, and especially toward God, when we have togetherness, the world will take note. This has been your Daily Dose, and I pray that you've been encouraged.